Fly over Mars. Take a trek through a prehistoric jungle. Tour a house that has not yet been built. It's called virtual reality, and as Jay Shaver found out, all it takes is a special helmet and a glove, and you're off.
I'm Ryan Androsoff, and welcome to Let's Think Digital. Today's episode is going to be all about the metaverse, talking about what it is, what the hype is, and what it might mean for the future of digital government. We've got a couple of great guests joining us in just a few minutes to unpack some of these concepts around the metaverse, talk about how we've actually been experimenting with it in the real world, so to speak. Before that, I'm really happy to have Wayne Chu, our podcast producer, joining me for today's episode. Welcome, Wayne.
All right.
And Wayne is actually joining me in the metaverse. For those who are listening to this on a podcast platform, we're actually filming our intro inside one of the metaverse platforms that we use to Think Digital. This is actually our VR Think Digital office using a platform called Spatial. And I'm having a conversation right now with Wayne's avatar and vice versa. So, Wayne, welcome to the metaverse. What's your take on all of this?
Well, I'm glad to be here. So, I'm really intrigued by this topic, not just because it's buzzy and everyone's talking about it, but also because it seems like we've been talking about this forever. One of the clips we played in the cold open was back in 1991. You heard Sam Donaldson from ABC News talking about this quote unquote new technology called virtual reality that would change how we interact with other people, with reality itself. And, the funny thing is that when you think back to Mark Zuckerberg on stage announcing the change of the name from Facebook to Meta and his vision for the metaverse, he's kind of basically saying the same thing.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I think, virtual reality, which is kind of one of the technologies that people associate with the metaverse, it's one of these technology trends that people have been saying is just around the corner, it seems like, for decades now, right? Going back certainly into the 90s. And, I remember this must have been mid-1990s. I was a student still back home in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And I remember we were going to buy one of the first kind of real PCs for my household. My dad had taken me down to a computer store in Saskatoon. And it must have been like a 386 or a 486, like Intel processor back then. And I remember talking to the sales guy. And so let's say this is probably 1995, 1996, somewhere around there. And we were talking about computer monitors and what the right one to get is. And I never forget, he kind of said to me, he said, you can get this one. He's like, but it's not going to matter. He's like, because by the time you need your next computer 3 or 4 years from now, hopefully we're all just going to be using VR headsets to kind of interact with everything that's going on. Well, here we are 25 years later, and, arguably VR is still kind of in its infancy, though I do kind of think in the last couple of years it's turned the corner a little bit, and it's moved from being something that's purely the domain of kind of high-end gaming sites or research labs to being now a consumer product for the first time.
Yeah, certainly cost is a factor. That report that we played was talking about how a VR system could cost up to $200,000, which in today's dollars is about $400,000, $500,000, and so.
Right. Thankfully, now we're down to about $400 or $500 for a headset.
I remember,
That's a big difference.
I remember experimenting with, what was it called, Google Cardboard, which was almost nothing. So that was really, really, really cool, really interesting. But to be frank, what I'm seeing in the media and how people are talking about these VR systems, it's all about gaming, and frankly, it's about sometimes it's about porn. So I'm a little bit skeptical, and I'm wondering, why are we talking about it on Let's Think Digital?
Yeah, listen, I think that's fair, right? Because a lot of the media hype about this, and it's probably true of a lot of new technologies, it tends to be like entertainment, right? That is kind of the entry point for a lot of people into some of this new tech. But the reality is, from my end, I do kind of see that there's now some real applications where the technology has gotten just mature enough that you can start seeing how this might be able to get applied into the real world, so to speak, and actually to kind of help people solve problems. But it's it's challenging, right? Because I think there's a lot of hype, as there is with any new technologies, and with VR, there's certainly some of the discussion around it right now very much is hype. And so being able to kind of sort through that and understand, where there might be some actual value, particularly for, for governments and public sector organizations, which is, the lens that we're kind of taking through this show, and where some of this, might be just, kind of entertainment and kind of a glorified toy. That's kind of the tough spot for us to kind of sort through. And so that's what I'm hoping in today's episode, we'll get a chance to kind of dive into that a little bit more. And, really excited to have two great guests joining us, Meghan and Jen, who are both associates with Think Digital, but have been part of this, what I will call an experiment with me over the last couple of years, where we've brought virtual reality into our digital leadership program and have been actually using it with, well over 100 now government executives to actually understand, what some of those real use cases might be. Jen, I'll go to you first just to give a very quick introduction.
Thanks, Brian. I'm very happy to be here today. And I'll just say that my background is in data science and cognitive science. So I have a particular focus on artificial intelligence and machine learning. And right now I'm really interested in the democratization of these technologies, how artificial intelligence is really becoming accessible and prevalent. So I'm looking forward to talking about that in the context of the metaverse today.
That's great. And Meghan?
Yeah, really happy to be here as well. So my name is Meghan Hellstern. I'm a specialist in human-centered design and user experience design. Been doing that for about 15 years, primarily in and around the public sector. I'm also a lifelong early adopter and someone who's fascinated by the different potential that technology brings to help us connect with each other across great distances. So really excited to chat all things metaverse with you all today.
So probably a good starting point for the conversation is, what is the metaverse, right? Because I think it's this term that has been, floating around now for a couple of years. It's kind of high on the hype cycle. But I think a lot of people don't, probably have a really good kind of deep grasp of what it kind of means underneath the surface. The fact that Facebook renamed itself Meta in terms of the parent company, they've certainly tried to kind of link their brand to the metaverse, but clearly it's about much more than just one company, right? Or one set of platforms. I'm curious, Meghan, Jen, whoever wants to jump in first, if you're trying to explain what the metaverse is, to friends and family, how do you tend to kind of describe it or conceptualize it?
Yeah, I can jump in maybe to start. So I'm a huge fan of science fiction, and Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, I believe, is maybe where the metaverse originated.
Yes.
And I
Meghan, I brought the prop here. I've got the book right here, so I was prepared for this.
Perfect. So I remember reading that as a teenager and feeling fascinated by that potential, right? This sort of idea that you could sort of jack into a parallel universe in a way, right? That's that kind of origin of that sort of metaverse, right? The universe. But a parallel universe where, you can kind of be anybody, you can interact with people across, again, great distances, you can customize and interact. And so in my mind, the metaverse really is this kind of parallel world that we can enter into through the internet, through computing, and interact with each other, whether that's in the context of games, learning from each other, collaborating, as we've done with our digital executive leadership program work, or any other number of use cases that I don't think we've even begun to scratch the surface on. So maybe over to you, Jen, to hear what you think or how you define the metaverse.
Yeah, and I'm so happy that we're talking about Snow Crash. So that's really great. But as you say, where are we at with it now? I often use the word immersive to try and get a sense of it for people who haven't tried it yet. And I say, it's an immersive digital environment that you can enter into. And I use that in the context of the term digital reality, because I'm often trying to explain to people, not just with respect to the metaverse, but in general, that increasingly we're building this digital reality on top of our physical reality, and the metaverse is sort of the ultimate realization of that digital reality. So that's how I talk about it.
Yeah. No, I mean, listen, I think both of those are great kind of definitions of, what this kind of emerging term means. There's this other term that people have been talking about in recent years of kind of Web3, right? And it's this evolution. We talked about, the initial World Wide Web back in the 90s. Then we had about, 15, 20 years ago, people started talking about Web 2.0, which was really about social media. And there's this term now of kind of Web3, which has gotten, a lot of it's kind of gotten caught up in like cryptocurrencies and decentralized, platforms. And there's a piece of that there. But certainly metaverse kind of gets talked about part and parcel with it. And it's, I think as both of you were kind of getting at, there's this notion of immersiveness, and people will sometimes talk about persistence, this idea of kind of a persistent digital experience, right? And I almost sometimes conceptually think about, the internet as it's evolved into has become a bit of a two-dimensional medium, and how do we essentially take the internet and make it three-dimensional, where you could kind of walk through the internet, engage with other people, and in some ways, maybe, and this is where some of the futurists are getting on this, that you've got a whole kind of economy that is entirely online, right? This kind of metaverse economy, metaverse experiences that are completely separate from your day-to-day life. I mean, that's where you both mentioned Snow Crash, which is kind of where the term got coined. There's Ready Player One, which people might be familiar with, the book, and also the movie that came out a few years ago, which is, I think, is a lot of people's kind of conception around it. And clearly the tech isn't quite there yet for those who've kind of dabbled with, using, virtual reality or augmented reality, which can be part of that. And it's worth actually, maybe just, I should mention for a second, when we talk about virtual reality or VR, we're talking about kind of the headsets that you've got kind of on your head that people have seen or heard me talk about in kind of the intro for this episode, where you're fully immersed in a digital space. And then augmented reality is where people are using a smart glass or even like their smartphone to have digital imagery kind of overlaid over top of the real world in front of them. And we can talk about this later, but I think a lot of people are really excited about where augmented reality might take us for some of those kind of professional and business applications. But I'm curious your thought on, there's been a lot of hype around this, right? And this is always the challenge, right? We get these new shiny tech things that kind of come up, although VR actually isn't that new in some ways. I mean, it's been around for decades in one form, but it's finally kind of, I think it's reached that inflection point where it's cheap enough and good enough that people can start using it in kind of interesting use cases. Obviously, a lot of companies are starting to throw serious money and resources at it. And, and there's this kind of a hype cycle that goes on this. And we're probably definitely somewhere high on the hype cycle right now. But I'm curious to get kind of a gut reaction from both of you as to, when we're talking about the metaverse as a concept or talking more specifically around things like virtual reality or augmented reality, like, do you think this is hype? Is it all kind of BS? Or is there something real there that you think might actually be useful for people? Jen, I'll go to you first if you want to dive in on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's good. I think it is, as you say, kind of reaching a next level. I mean, there's always these sort of levels and then plateaus and then levels. Artificial intelligence is like this as well, for sure. But I do think I've been talking to a number of skeptics, and I'm often saying, like, no, I think that we're starting to reach a point where a lot of people know what this is. A lot of people recognize the technology. And it's just starting to be more pervasive. And in my experience, people are quite skeptical about it until they have actually tried it. So to me, that's kind of like the biggest obstacle. People be like, oh, I don't know about this. I'm not convinced. People have been talking about this for a while. And I'm like, well, would you like to try it out? Put on the headset. And then they go, oh my gosh. And so there's a bit of that going on too.
Yeah, Megan, what's your sense of kind of like the hype cycle level on all this?
Yeah, I mean, to build off of what Jen was sharing, I will say there are definitely skeptics out there, and I might have even been one of them, to be honest, when Ryan initially approached me about, his wild idea about, teaching executives about, design and cutting edge sort of digital practices in VR. I definitely had a moment where I was like, this is either Ryan's craziest idea and worst idea or best idea. I don't think there's going to be a middle ground. And in my case, it was a lot of my past experiences with less accessible, more clunky, not quite as immersive, to use Jen's term, technology. And I was sort of like, I don't know how people are going to react to that. And then we tried some of the latest hardware, and I really started to see how we've hit this kind of point where that measure of kind of accessibility, ease of learning it, again, lots to be critiqued on the onboarding and learning curve, but it's
Yep.
way better than it ever has been in history. I think we are hitting that point where sort of the widespread consumerization is really well underway. And in my mind, even if there is sort of that peak of inflated expectations, it's rapidly going to approach perhaps a dip, as Gartner kind of argues, but likely that mainstreaming is going to become more and more sort of normalized, especially as, again, the costs go down, the number and sort of variety of use cases increases, right? I'm seeing games. I'm a big gamer, so I not only use VR for our teaching and some of our other educational work, but I'm also using it for gaming, and I'm noticing just this explosion of different types of games, everything from very relaxing Zen, puzzlers, or not even games, sort of just these immersive experiences, to, cutting edge AAA shooters that are online and collaborative. And to me, that's all kind of indicative of this movement towards a more mainstreamed sort of approach. And I think a lot of that can be traced back to, again, as controversial as it was when Meta / Facebook got into this space, that kind of money, that kind of talent, right, that kind of mainstream sort of company getting into this has really helped accelerate, I think, the movement towards that normalization, wherever we are on the particular, hype curve from Gartner at this present time.
Yeah, and Wayne and I were talking about this a little bit in the intro to the episode. I think as you were saying, the reason Meta's kind of introduction into this has been so important in my view is they brought that kind of price point down and the hardware down to a place where you could start actually imagining in a practical way using this for certain applications. And I think that's actually a great lead-in to talk a little bit about how we've been using VR in the digital leadership program that we run with the Institute on Governance, which is one of our partner organizations based here in Ottawa. So for the last 4 years now, we've run a digital executive leadership program, which is it's kind of like a week-long boot camp style program for executives in government to help them kind of understand what the big trends are in the digital world. We do deep dives into a number of topics, including a day where we do a deep dive into Meghan's topic area around design thinking, a deep dive into data science that Jen leads. And so, March 2020, COVID hit. We had to move all of our programming, like everybody else in the world, fully online. And I remember in kind of those early weeks and months of us kind of reimagining how we're going to do executive training like this for the digital world. Aside from obviously moving to video conferencing using things like Zoom, I was starting to think in the back of my head, and I had already started experimenting with VR in kind of a personal capacity. Maybe this is an opportunity for us to kind of give people both that immersive experience as part of this learning journey they're on, but also, get them some hands-on experience with the tech. I mean, to Jen's point, I think when people actually try it, it just gives you a bit of a different flavor for it. And one of the things we always try to do in the digital leadership program is, to take government executives and both kind of bring them up to speed to where the world is today, but also get them thinking about the future, right? What are those future trends around technology and how is that likely to impact their world going forward? And, as Meghan said, I had this crazy idea to say, what if we actually gave everybody a VR headset to use during the program and actually tried to kind of take some of our content and adapt it into this kind of three-dimensional experience they can have in VR. And I appreciate Meghan and Jen being willing to kind of humor me on this crazy idea, which I hope Meghan has now turned out to be one of my better ideas, because I like to think kind of this far in, it's we've had some good success. But I'd love to kind of maybe get both of you to explain a little bit, and Meghan, maybe I'll start with you. On in your modules in particular, I think you've really kind of embraced bringing virtual reality into it. So Meghan, on the design thinking front, be great to have you walk everybody through, how we've incorporated virtual reality into our training around design thinking.
Absolutely. And you're totally right, Ryan. I'm now converted from skeptic to believer in this stuff. And I really do believe we are just scratching the surface on the potential of virtual reality, especially in the education space. There really is something, especially in design, which is a very sort of tangible practice that is best learned through doing. The VR space allows for some possibilities that, especially when you have folks who are distributed over distance, I'm not sure you can have in any other way, really, to be honest. Especially for things like physical product design, but increasingly for other spaces as well, which is what I'll tell you about the way that we use it in our course. So when we were delivering these in person, we had a sort of simple design sprint exercise where we would get executives to learn a bit of the theory up front and then actually work through applying it to a sort of real world example that was ideally relatable to the sort of public sector context that they were working in. And so we chose to use air travel as a sort of relatable domain. It's got lots of regulations, lots of constraints. It's something that most people have experience with. Most people probably have opinions on, fixing or improving in some way. And so for, many, many cohorts, we had been doing this kind of in-person design sprint where we would get them to improve the air travel experience through, user research, ideation, coming up with some new improvements, and then prototyping those, building sort of actual models or, versions of those changes and what they could look like, whether that's a, poster for a new service improvement or a new waiting line model. They might build a little kind of 3D character sketch, things like that. And so it was actually so cool to see how easily and even better it was to do that in virtual reality. So typically we're in a classroom, we have sort of whiteboards and things like that around us, but you really have to imagine yourself at the airport. Well, in VR, we were able to actually build a model of an airport, and we could have folks in this sort of waiting lounge area building prototypes in the context that they might be used. And so we had, background ambiance that kind of really put you into that space. And so not only is it really powerful for providing that context, we also allow folks to, bring objects into the space, physically move them around, show how, for example, a new method for doing security screening might be able to speed things up, or, improving the in-flight sort of experience of entertainment. We had an actual model of an airplane, which was a kind of exotic thing during the pandemic when none of us could travel. But people could actually show, what that new in-flight entertainment monitor might look like, things like that. And so between the kind of collaborative potential and then also this really deep ability to jump into a context, and airports are just one example, but imagine that you're trying to design something for a Coast Guard ship, or you're trying to design something for super sensitive ecological environments where you can't just go there easily and you can't just mess around with prototypes at the early stage. The VR really allows you to, again, test things with real users potentially in a much more contextually sensitive way that I think is so powerful. And again, as far as I know, some of what we're doing with this program is really cutting edge. I don't know of many other comparables anywhere in the world, and it makes me very excited to see how we continue to layer on, additional ways to dive into that sort of mix of live collaboration, context-dependent sort of space, and really world building in a way that can enrich so many aspects of learning and teaching, of course, as well.
Yeah, and I like that, Megan. It's a great way of putting it, of kind of, world building for learning. And I think you're right. It kind of gives you context on these concepts in a way that's tough to do if you're doing it a bit more kind of two-dimensionally in one way or the other. And I think, Jen, that leads in really well, to the piece that you've been doing is around thinking about, okay, how do you take kind of data and think about the possibilities around data in the world of virtual reality?
Absolutely. And it was as Megan was talking, and she was talking about how it's great to reproduce the world, some version of the world in virtual reality. I'm thinking about digital twins that we'll maybe talk about later. But my use was quite different because in my case, we were doing something that we weren't reproducing the world. We were doing something that you couldn't do in the actual world, because my use was to use it to do three-dimensional immersive data visualization. And so basically taking a data set, coming up with novel types of visualization. So moving away from, you were talking about how the internet right now is very two-dimensional, and so in visualization you can think of, you have bar charts, that kind of thing. Whereas in this case, you're creating these visualizations that are three-dimensional. You can move into them in a space, and unlike a situation where you're very familiar with that space, in this case you start out in sort of almost like a void, like a black void, like you're in outer space, and then you basically zoom into the data visualization, and you can move, and so you can see it at different scales. So that's basically what I was doing with people in the workshop. I was taking a data set or multiple data sets, and we're using some visualizations, some that we had created, some that were created by people who used the software that we were using called Flow Immersive. And then we were sort of exploring what that experience was like to look at data in a three-dimensional immersive context.
Yeah, and you know, I think both of these have been really kind of interesting kind of use cases for people, you know, again, whose kind of context around this might just be entertainment, right? Like, I think a lot of people think about VR and they think about gaming, Meghan, as you mentioned, or, you know, VR videos, you know, like the classic one, you're on a kind of a roller coaster with the helmet on and, you know, experiencing kind of the thrills of, you know, of going through a roller coaster experience or something like that. You know, I think for a lot of our participants, when they did this, most of them, I would say almost across the board, 90% of them haven't really used VR before, certainly not in any kind of intensive way. And I think the reaction to trying this is always really interesting. I mean, I'm curious, you know, from both of you, what your kind of experience has been around that. You know, I certainly find that a lot of our participants in the program come into it and they tell us this, you know, as skeptics on VR. But I think Jen, a little bit to your point, you know, that you made earlier, once they kind of put the headset on and try it, I think at the end we kind of see people really have these aha moments of, you know, this is actually, there's some real possibilities. I mean, curious, Jen, on the data side, if you have any kind of reactions that have really stuck with you, you know, in terms of participants who've used this and what they've kind of found has been useful about it or not useful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in my case, they just have a really strong visceral reaction to being able to get into, like, literally get into the data. And so one of the visualizations we have relates to City of Ottawa bicycle data, and just them being able to, I have to describe a little bit the application a little bit more maybe. So like I said, you started in basically in outer space, and then suddenly these visualizations appear in front of you, and people are basically maneuvering. They have, and Ryan, I'm going to borrow your phrase, because they have like what we call like a broomstick that they can like fly around and check out the visualization. And so you can see them kind of exclaiming over, oh my gosh, I can go see this over here. And that I really love the fact that they can go in and look at certain parts of the visualization really closely, and they get really into that. But then you see them also kind of like zooming way back out and having that larger perspective. And so there's kind of, people seem really excited to be able to experience data in this visceral way. And this is important because for a lot of people, data is really abstract. It's really hard to engage with. And so getting to see them, like, being able to essentially physically interact with it is just really exciting. They seem to really like that.
Yeah, and even I find for myself when you're in there, just that ability to kind of, you know, I consider myself fairly data literate, but that ability to kind of like feel the height of, like, you know, the data and see it. I think our human senses have evolved to process three-dimensional information like that because we're hardwired, right, to perceive the world around us. And so I think, you know, when you kind of bring that to data, just like, to me, it gets me thinking about how much more effective would like briefings for decision makers be, where they can actually kind of feel the data versus it being this kind of abstract thing on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper.
Yeah, it's the difference between looking at a picture on a page and walking into the page and walking through the space. And so, as you say, we're very much hardwired for that type of interaction. So yeah.
Meghan, in the design thinking activities you do in Spatial, which is one of the other VR platforms that we use, and actually had a chance in the intro, our listeners heard Wayne getting his exposure to it. We brought him into our Think Digital Metaverse office in Spatial. What are some of the reactions you've seen? And I'm curious, Meghan, if anything has surprised you about, you know, the reaction of these government executives that we bring into our metaverse spaces.
Yeah, it has definitely been a wide range of reactions, I would say. Some folks immediately get it, and there's just that feeling of awe. And, like, I think one person literally said, "Where was this the entire pandemic?" I really miss this kind of feeling of collaborating in person. I'm air quoting there. Obviously, you're not really in person, but it does replicate a lot of that feeling of being in a room and that kind of fluid, open exchange, right, of ideas that is often what we're looking for when we want to have, a
Hmm.
collaborative meeting in particular. So there's definitely that sort of group. I would say too, there's of course a learning curve. What is a little different, I would say, about Spatial, the software we use for the design thinking activities, is that it really is an immersive environment that you need to learn to navigate. And I've noticed that learning curve, even things like I remember I was coaching one person and I said, oh, you need to move the joystick in this direction. And she's like, I don't even know what a joystick is. And like kind of really being reminded of sort of this unfolding set of skills and literacy that I think increasingly we're going to need to be adopting, ideally from a young age, but even as technology changes, finding those ways to help folks feel comfortable and really get into it. Now, all that's to say, in general, I think the accessibility of this is better than it ever has been. I would say, I don't know, Ryan, there's maybe 1 in 10 folks who really struggle with some of the physical effects, whether it's feeling a little nauseous or things like that. But in general, I was really surprised because I must say, coming into it, thinking it was one of Ryan's wildest ideas, I was ready for every reaction from like, I hate this, I don't want to do this at all, and
Yep.
onwards. And it's been very little of that. It's been a lot of curiosity, interest, folks kind of starting to think, to build on what Jen was sharing around briefings, right? Hey, like instead of me showing a floor plan, why can't I just build a model and have you walk through the new service center and actually see what it might look like? Instead of me kind of showing you a static web page, can I not show you in context what that might look like, someone at the passport office doing this, right? So that kind of potential seems to be pretty apparent pretty quickly to folks. Um, so I have to give a lot
Yeah,
of credit
and
to
and I
Ryan
think
for that,
Megan, what's
developing
interesting
that
about it
what
is,
you're talking about.
we've now run this with 5 or 6 cohorts of the program over the course of 2 years. I think we got a pretty decent sample size. I think well over 100 people now who've kind of been through these VR activities with us, and you see some patterns. And and I think it's important to recognize, right? Like I don't think I don't want us to come across as completely just being cheerleading for VR, because I think there is some reality of there is some challenges still, right? And we ask people afterwards if they have challenges with nausea or feeling motion sickness when they're using it, and we do find about like 50 to 60% of them do tend to have some kind of discomfort when they first use it. But I think, as you said, Megan, it's usually only about, I'd say, 1 in 10 who find it to be kind of a persistent issue, using it over the course of a week. We always try to make sure with any of the VR platforms we're using that they also have a kind of web-based version that people can use if they really do have, physical discomfort with using the headsets. And of course, I mean, there are some legitimate issues around accessibility, and certainly folks who might require kind of additional support one way or the other. VR is not going to necessarily work for everyone. But I think elements of it, can be quite powerful, and when you have that kind of backup version that is browser based, it helps to kind of bridge that gap a little bit. But one of the things I kind of wonder when we're kind of thinking through, some of the equity considerations around not just metaverse, but I think in general when we're thinking about kind of new tech coming in, right, is this is great for big companies, big governments that have lots of resources that they can kind of throw at this. The question always becomes, is this going to be realistic for small, lesser resource communities? And Jen, I was just kind of thinking about, in the data space. I mean, you and I do a lot of work with government agencies and departments, who frankly sometimes struggle to get resources to do pretty basic like data management, data governance work, and so on the one hand, I think there's this argument that we have to do a lot of that more kind of basic plumbing work to get things to work. Yet on the other hand, we're saying, hey, you can have really impactful data visualization and improve decision making if we bring kind of virtual reality, 3-dimensional data visualization in. I'm curious if you have thoughts on kind of how we rectify those, what kind of seems almost like diametrically opposed like views to it.
It is a bit tricky, and I mean, I've seen this with artificial intelligence as well. So VR, these new technologies, And there can be a gap, as you say, where there's certain people who are really trailblazers and they want to bring in this great tech. And in some ways that's really exciting because they push the envelope and they give people something to aim for when they're trying to do some of that other more basic work. So in some ways I'm a proponent of people who are pushing the envelope and bringing in the new tech. But as you say, there is a tension there. And so I think that people have to be aware that when they're bringing in that new tech, very quickly after that, they have to start saying, or even at the same time, but what is the infrastructure and what is the governance and all of those pieces that we have to have in place to support this tech? Because you don't want to run before you can walk. So yeah, it's great to have that goal, but let's say, okay, it's not going to be next week before we can all do this. Let's make some realistic plans to get us here in good shape. And that way people don't get turned off of the technology as well, because that can happen where people get excited about it, then it doesn't work, and then everybody goes, oh, well, it's not that exciting.
Yeah, but I like that idea of kind of using what I might call aspirational technology to inspire people to sometimes, fix the more basic issues that let you be able to get there. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we have the same conversation when you and I, do work or talk about artificial intelligence and other things in that area, which hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss on a future podcast as well.
Well, and these are all of these technologies are, I mean, when we think about data, I talk about data as being the fuel. So in a sense, all of these technologies require a lot of fuel. And so, they can be aspirational, but you have to realize they do need that fuel. So you have to be prepared for that.
Jen, while we're kind of on some of these aspirational topics of how this tech can be used, one of the terms you mentioned earlier was digital twins.
Yeah.
And I'd love for you to kind of unpack that a little bit because, I think one of the really interesting spaces to me around where some of these kind of metaverse technologies can play a role is on improving decision making, right? And, we're talking about like how do we help decision makers kind of literally visualize kind of the policy options they had in front of them. I think there's some really potentially compelling use cases around this as this matures. And one of these things that's being talked about, I find a lot in the last few months, is digital twins. So can you define that and talk a little bit about how that links into the discussion about the metaverse?
Definitely. And I will say, I've been hearing it a lot increasingly as well. And I feel like it was maybe even a couple of years ago, you, Ryan, might have been one of the first people to talk to me about this, as because you're always on the cutting edge. You're always knowing what's up and coming. And so I was very intrigued because my background is in simulations. And so digital twins have some of that. So what a digital twin is, it is, you can think of it as a simulation of a real world object, but it's a very high fidelity simulation. So if you think about something like, if you play video games, then you know that often they'll create a fascinating virtual world, but it's not really real. It's very cardboard. There's no substance to what they're creating. A digital twin is like the opposite of that, where it is tied to something in the real world, and there's a stream of data that's coming back and forth between the two. And so it really reflects, sometimes from a moment to moment perspective, what is happening with that real world object. And this is being made possible by the Internet of Things. So you can have sensors on the real object, and then, it gets translated into this simulation that's very realistic. And then you can go in the other direction too, where your simulation, you can have some artificial intelligence, machine learning components of that it might say, you know what, in 10 minutes, this machine component is going to break. So you have to replace it right now before it breaks and keep everything moving. And the simulation is happening sometimes at the level of something very specific, like a part of a machine. But now they're starting to do this for things like entire airports. Meghan, speaking of airports, they're trying to make digital twins of basically entire airports, including all of the pieces in the airport, so they can understand on a moment-to-moment basis what is going to happen next. So, so it's very exciting technology. And I think you can see how it meshes really well with the virtual world, because if you want to interact with the digital twin, where better to do that than in a virtual reality context, because you can put it right into that virtual reality context. So that's, I don't know, that's, I could talk about a lot, but that's just like a high level description.
No, that's great. I mean, I think that's really helpful. I kind of, I think about this, the movie Apollo 13, right? Where,
Yes.
looking back in the 60s and they were, stuck in space, spacecrafts having issues. They had the folks on the ground in the simulator of the capsule trying to it was essentially it was kind of a simulation twin, but that ability to have like a digital version of that, to your point, you can spin it up, quickly, you can have really high fidelity on it. And again, this all, like in my mind, again, this links into this notion of kind of improving decision making as a result of this. So go ahead, Jen.
And I was going to say, the exciting thing about it, if you think about it from a virtual reality point of view, is that if you start to have these in virtual reality, you move away from that almost sort of cardboard fakeness of virtual reality, where if you're, I don't know, Megan, if you've had this experience where you want to explore an object in virtual reality, like a plant or something, but it's not very well created, and so it still feels fake. Whereas from a digital twin perspective, if you had a plant in virtual reality that was basically a digital twin of a plant somewhere in the world, then you would really be able to interact with it in a way that was very real. So I see interesting synergies there.
Yeah, Megan, I know you've done a little bit of work around or had some experience with digital twins as well. Curious your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I will definitely share a little bit on that. This is also an interesting link back into some of the equity questions we were talking about, because, Jen mentioned it, right? This type of high quality and really immersive, really true to life replication really requires extremely high speed internet, the ability to, have high cutting edge technology to interact with it as well. Like the Oculus Quest that we use for our digital executive leadership program is a really great sort of serviceable model, but it's not going to be able to interact with like the highest quality digital twins out there. And so there's a really interesting access question, right, of which companies or which organizations or things like that actually get access to this, and who has, sort of the infrastructure even to support, the level of high speed internet and things like that are required. But I do have an interesting example from some work I've done in the past on housing. And so housing, as you can imagine, for digital twinning this is a huge breakthrough, particularly around things like participatory design and getting feedback on new developments. So one of the biggest struggles, and you've probably been to these if you've ever gone to a consultation on a new condo or something going up, they have, sort of a non-digital analog twin, right? The little models that you can kind of interact with. But again, they're lacking context. They're not to scale. They don't usually show you how that fits into the existing environment. And so people are being asked to give feedback on something that's still very abstract, even though it's a literal physical model. And so there's been some really cool studies done around trying to understand, for example, people's perception and the impact of things like high density housing on their physiology, on their psychology, and things like that. And so imagine, being walked down your local street and there's sort of a scenario A, B, and C, and you can kind of see what it looks like with very high density, lots of condos and new things going up, medium density, maybe some missing middle houses beside you, and then kind of current state. And you can really viscerally understand how this might impact both yourself as well as your community around you. And so I'm really, really excited to see that continuing to become more and more widespread and accessible, because I really think it can revolutionize and perhaps overcome some of the sort of, FUD, right? That fear, uncertainty, doubt. We see the little model, we can't quite contextualize it. And so we often knee-jerk to say, oh, I don't want that. And so I think there's a real opportunity for us, especially again in that civic and sort of government space, to really help people see the changes that are coming down the pipe and feel more comfortable with them as a result, because of these digital twins and these immersive experiences.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, I think there's this real opportunity, frankly, if it's used right for these kind of metaverse technologies like virtual reality, to build empathy, right? I mean, I think they can be actually very powerful empathy building tools. I've seen examples from organizations like the UN and international human rights groups that essentially kind of build immersive documentaries so you can get the experience of what it's like for refugees, right, who are dealing with conflict. And, that ability to, Megan, as you're illustrating screen to kind of experience things as if you were there, but also to be able to kind of put yourself in somebody else's shoes in quite a literal way. I mean, those are powerful experiences. And we often talk about, in the digital world, empathy is actually kind of the most important digital skill, because if we're truly going to build user-centered government, you've got to be able to understand the people that you're serving. And I kind of hold out hope. I think it's kind of easy to kind of, be concerned about, the dystopian future that, the metaverse might enable, and people kind of like to hate on it a little bit. But I do think if it's used responsibly, like any other tool, there's potentially a real upside to that. And then maybe that kind of gets me as we kind of close the conversation off, and Meghan, maybe I'll ask you first, what do you think the future of this is going to look like? If we kind of look back on this 5 or 10 years from now, is this going to have just been like a hype bubble where we're like, man, what were we smoking that we thought this was going to be a real thing? Or do you think we're all going to be walking around, with AR glasses on our heads on the street? Like, I'm kind of curious, like what kind of future world you think this is going to bring to us, if we kind of look out, a decade or so down the road.
Absolutely. Well, I'm a big, as I mentioned, big sci-fi fan, and so I'd be remiss not to quote one of my favorite authors, William Gibson, who says that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed, right? And so I do feel that we're already seeing pockets of where this could go, all over the place, including the program that we're doing, I think is a good example of kind of what this could look like in the context of education. I want to share one example of a very cool experience I haven't had the privilege of trying, but to me, this is where I hope it goes in terms of empathy and sort of immersiveness. There's this artist that did this. It's actually an Oscar-winning sort of film, but it's in a VR context. It's called Carne y Arena, and it's actually meant to be a replication of the experience of being a refugee trying to cross the border. And so you're wearing VR headsets and a haptic device, which gives you sort of physical feedback. Every person has a different role, so every time you go through it, you're going to have a different experience than the last time. And essentially, it's meant to be this sort of visceral empathy building process. And in my mind, this is really where I hope it goes, is that we push the edges of this technology, we use it to sort of build connection and not move towards that kind of disconnected, sort of very, like a dystopian type future that there's lots of sci-fi that, has explored, but really towards this place where we are able to use these technologies to connect over time and distance and really understand each other in a different way. And I've definitely seen that with our program, and I'm really excited to see it continue. And I hope that, folks are inspired by this conversation to go out and start experimenting with it, because it is, if I've learned anything from our early VR pieces, it's that it's actively being co-created right now. We've given feedback to some of the programs that we are working with because it is so new. And so we need lots of different types of people interacting with these, advocating for things like greater accessibility, equity, improvements to the software and hardware. And through that, I think we're going to be able to get to somewhere pretty magical and amazing.
Yeah. And I think, what you're just sharing, Meghan, kind of reminds us, like, we've got agency on this to build the future that we want to see, right? And so, I think it's important for us to kind of recognize that these are tools that can be used for good purposes and bad purposes, and to be, thoughtful and conscientious about that at this kind of still somewhat early stage of development can have big impacts down the road. Jen, what's your view on this when we kind of look to the future? If we're having this conversation in 2033, what do you think we're going to be thinking about when we kind of look back on these kind of early days of the metaverse and where it went?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm hoping that things will get a little bit more, I want to say, sophisticated. I'm going to borrow a page from Meghan's book, because I remember once we were doing a bit of a sort of a we're setting something up for one of the workshops, and we were talking about the user interfaces, and right now they're still a little clunky. So I'm looking forward to seeing how those get more sophisticated as the technology develops. You mentioned augmented reality as opposed to virtual reality. And so I think there's going to be two paths, where one is the virtual reality development, and we're using that in certain contexts. But I think augmented reality, which is almost, I want to call it like the little sister of virtual reality, is going to come up the side. And I think that's going to be tremendously important, because once it gets working, we keep talking about the glasses, it's going to overlay a very rich data environment on our regular world. So that, yep, I think is something that I'm anticipating will happen. in terms of one of the things I want to see that I would love to see come out of this is actually open source virtual reality, because you mentioned that right now it's the domain of folks like Facebook. And it's true that they have done a huge amount to push this technology forward, but I really want to see a space where there are more options, and some of them are open source and more DIY. So that is something else that I hope will also be happening in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think there's a whole bunch of legitimate issues around like centralization and control of this, right? And I think personally there's a lot of parallels to what we've seen with social media over the last, 10 to 20 years, and some of the real kind of challenges I think we're having with these, highly centralized, controlled social media platforms that have become so integral to how the world works today. I think we could be having those same conversations 10 years from now if we're not thoughtful about it. And I love that idea, Jen, and I know there's some discussion happening already about, how do you have open source, and also at the very minimum, like open protocols, right? Like one of the reasons the internet became such an interesting place is it was built on this foundation of open protocols so that all the websites could talk to each other. And I think, to be frank, like we don't want to get ourselves in a world of like walled gardens where, if you've got Meta's headset, you can only access Meta's, metaverse spaces. I want to see a world that kind of mirrors the openness of the internet, in the metaverse space. And so I think, again, being intentional about some of those design choices now and having these conversations at this stage of the game is important, because it's tough to unpack these things down the road once it's, inertia has kind of set into these new designs that come out. Listen, this has been a great conversation. I really want to thank you both. I think there's a lot more, that's going to be coming into this area in the last little while, and we're going to see over the coming years, where this evolves to. And again, I think we wanted one of our early episodes here on the podcast to actually talk about some of this kind of shiny tech and be able to think through what's hype, what's real, because this is the stuff that people are facing coming down. And I think sometimes we kind of ignore some of these trends that are apparel, and it is important to kind of understand where there might be some real use cases underneath here that can be valuable to folks. And so, just to say, it's been a real pleasure and honor kind of piloting this with both of you over the last couple of years. I've been really excited about our chance to kind of bring, virtual reality into our virtual classroom together, and excited to see where some of this can go in the future. So Jen, Meghan, thanks so much for joining today. It's been great.
My pleasure. It's always great to talk to you too.
Thanks for having me. This was wonderful.
We started this episode talking about hype, right? Talking about the hype of the metaverse, and if, there's something real there, or if this is really just kind of the newest Silicon Valley hype from the big tech companies that they're trying to get people to buy into. And this, I think, is always the problem with new technology that's coming on the scene. It can be really easy to both be seen to and to actually be kind of chasing the shiny object, right? We talk about shiny object syndrome often in this space. But the flip side is that if we simply dismiss all of these new technologies coming down the pipeline and that are entering society, it also means we might miss big important trends until it's too late. And so for me, this is why it's so important for us to start having conversations around things like the metaverse, because I really do think there is a positive future that these metaverse technologies can contribute to, but it's ultimately going to be up to us to design that future together. So I want to hear what you think. We'd love to hear your reaction to this episode, and in particular, how some of the ideas we discussed resonate with you. And if you've got a different opinion, we'd love to hear that as well. Reach out to us on social media using the Let's Think Digital hashtag, or email us at podcast@thinkdigital.ca. And if you liked what you heard, and if you've been enjoying the podcast so far, please help us get the word out. We're a new podcast, and so we need your help to be able to reach out to friends, to family, to colleagues who you think might be interested in the types of topics and conversations that we're having here on this podcast. Certainly, if you're able to give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast apps, that certainly helps for visibility. And we really encourage you to share on your social networks and even person to person with those who you think might be interested in some of the topics we're talking about here. Of course, we're online at letsthinkdigital.ca, or you can also visit and subscribe to our YouTube channel at Let's Think Digital. Today's episode was produced by myself, Wayne Chu, and Mel Han. Thanks again so much for listening, and keep thinking digitally.